There are moments in the history of medicine when a single demonstration changes the way an entire field thinks about what is possible. The discovery of penicillin was one. The first successful organ transplant was another. The moment a paralyzed man named Nolan Arbaugh moved a computer cursor across a screen using nothing, but his thoughts may belong in that same category, not because the technology is finished or perfected, but because it proves something that decades of neuroscience research had been building toward. The boundary between the human brain and the digital world is not impenetrable. It can be crossed carefully, precisely, and with consequences that neither the patients experiencing them nor the engineers designing the systems fully anticipated. Neuralink, the brain-computer interface company founded by Elon Musk, has spent years operating at the edge of what is scientifically credible and what is publicly believable. For a long time, the gap between those two things was wide enough to generate significant skepticism. Brain chips sounded like science fiction. The idea that a small device implanted in the skull could read the electrical intentions of neurons and translate them into meaningful digital actions seemed to belong to a future that was always a decade away. What 2024 and 2025 demonstrated, through real patients living real lives with these devices, is that the future arrived earlier than most people expected, and that it arrived with both the promise and the complications that genuinely transformative technologies always bring. The N1 implant, Neuralink's current device, is a remarkable piece of engineering compressed into a form factor that replaces a small section of skull bone and sits flush against the brain surface. It contains 1,024 electrodes distributed across 64 flexible threads, each thread thinner than human hair, designed to detect the electrical signals that neurons generate when the brain forms movement intentions. These signals are processed by onboard chips, transmitted wirelessly to an external receiver, and interpreted by software that translates neural patterns into cursor movements, keystrokes, or commands that digital devices can execute. The entire system operates without wires passing through the skin, without a visible external component, and without the constant attention of medical staff. It is, in a meaningful sense, the first consumer-grade brain-computer interface, though describing it that way requires careful qualification about what consumer-grade means in this context. Elon Musk announced at the close of 2025 that Neuralink will begin high-volume production of these devices in 2026, targeting more than 1,000 implants for deployment, and that the surgical procedure used to install them would transition to an almost entirely automated process. That announcement represents a significant escalation in scale from where the program stood when its first human trial began in early 2024. Understanding what that escalation means, what it makes possible, and what questions it raises requires starting with the patients who have already lived through the experience of carrying one of these devices and whose feedback has shaped every subsequent decision the company has made. Nolan Arbaugh became the first human to receive a Neuralink implant in January 2024, and his story contains more complexity and more honest information about what this technology actually involves than any press release or investor presentation. Before the procedure, Nolan had been living with quadriplegia following a severe spinal cord injury that severed the communication pathway between his brain and his body. His brain continued to generate normal movement intentions with full neurological fidelity. When he decided to reach for a glass of water, the neurons responsible for initiating that movement fired exactly as they would in any healthy person. The signal simply could not travel past the point of injury. Neuralink's device was designed to intercept that signal before it reached the damaged pathway, capture it digitally, and route it to wherever it needed to go. In the weeks immediately following his surgery, Nolan learned to move a computer cursor using his thoughts. He browsed the internet, played chess, communicated through text, and began reclaiming a degree of independence and agency that his injury had taken from him. The recovery from the surgery itself was striking in its simplicity relative to what most people associate with brain procedures. He was discharged from the hospital within a day. He did not require pain medication. The incision healed cleanly. For someone who had spent years navigating the physical and emotional weight of complete paralysis, the procedure's relatively low burden was itself significant. The complication that appeared several weeks later was serious enough to have ended the program under different circumstances. Approximately 85% of the electrode threads implanted in Nolan's brain lost optimal contact with the neural tissue they were designed to monitor. The threads had shifted subtly, a mechanical response to the micromotion that exists naturally between the brain and the skull. The signals being captured dropped in number and quality to the point where Nolan's cursor control degraded substantially. He prepared himself for the possibility that the device would need to be removed entirely, which would have meant another surgery, and the psychological weight of losing something that had already begun to feel like a part of how he interacted with the world. What happened instead became one of the most important moments in Neuralink's history. Rather than scheduling a surgical intervention, the engineering team delivered a software update wirelessly to the implant. The update refined the algorithms responsible for interpreting neural signals, improving their ability to extract meaningful information from the electrodes that still had viable contact. Within weeks, Nolan's performance not only recovered but surpassed the levels he had achieved when all electrodes were functioning. His cursor movement became faster, more precise, and more responsive than it had been at any previous point. The remaining electrodes, now interpreted by better software, outperformed the full complement of electrodes operating under inferior algorithms. This outcome contains a lesson that extends well beyond Neuralink-specific technology. It demonstrated that a brain implant is not a static medical device in the way that a hip replacement or a cochlear implant traditionally has been. It is a platform, a combination of hardware and software that can improve after implantation without requiring the patient to undergo another procedure. The hardware provides the interface. The software determines how effectively that interface is used. And software, unlike hardware, can be updated continuously as engineers learn more about how individual brains generate and express neural signals. The implication for patients is profound. The device they receive on the day of surgery is not the final version of what they will have. It is a starting point of an ongoing improvement process that operates entirely through wireless updates with no additional surgical risk. The second patient to receive an implant, identified publicly as Alex, benefited directly from what the team learned through Nolan's experience. Implanted in mid-2024, Alex achieved functional cursor control faster than Nolan had, with smoother and more precise movements from the beginning. What happened instead became one of the most important moments in Neuralink's history. Rather than scheduling a surgical intervention, the engineering team delivered a software update wirelessly to the implant. The update refined the algorithms responsible for interpreting neural signals, improving their ability to extract meaningful information from the electrodes that still had viable contact. Within weeks, Nolan's performance not only recovered but surpassed the levels he had achieved when all electrodes were functioning. His cursor movement became faster, more precise, and more responsive than it had been at any previous point. The remaining electrodes, now interpreted by better software, outperformed the full complement of electrodes operating under inferior algorithms. This outcome contains a lesson that extends well beyond Neuralink-specific technology. It demonstrated that a brain implant is not a static medical device in the way that a hip replacement or a cochlear implant traditionally has been. It is a platform, a combination of hardware and software that can improve after implantation without requiring the patient to undergo another procedure. The hardware provides the interface. The software determines how effectively that interface is used. And software, unlike hardware, can be updated continuously as engineers learn more about how individual brains generate and express neural signals. The implication for patients is profound. The device they receive on the day of surgery is not the final version of what they will have. It is a starting point of an ongoing improvement process that operates entirely through wireless updates with no additional surgical risk. The second patient to receive an implant, identified publicly as Alex, benefited directly from what the team learned through Nolan's experience. Implanted in mid-2024, Alex achieved functional cursor control faster than Nolan had, with smoother and more precise movements from the beginning. The issue of thread retraction that had affected the first implant was substantially reduced, reflecting engineering adjustments made between the two procedures. Over time, Alex developed the ability to design three-dimensional objects on a computer, play complex video games for extended periods, and operate digital interfaces with fluency that made the brain-computer connection feel increasingly natural rather than effortful. The progression from the first patient to the second illustrated a development trajectory that the team would replicate across subsequent cases. By the end of 2025, 12 patients had received Neuralink implants across multiple countries, representing a range of conditions that the technology is designed to address. The approved applications at this stage include paralysis resulting from spinal cord injury, the progressive motor neuron loss of ALS, and conditions affecting speech and communication. Patients in the trial cohort have included military veterans, individuals in advanced stages of ALS who had lost the ability to speak or move their limbs independently, and people for whom the loss of digital communication capability had meant profound social isolation. Across this diverse group, the outcomes have shared certain consistent characteristics. Every participant achieved meaningful improvement in their ability to control digital devices using neural signals. None experienced serious infection, brain injury, or measurable cognitive decline. Minor technical issues arose across multiple cases, but were addressed through software adjustments rather than additional surgery. The surgical procedure itself has evolved significantly since the first implantation, and the evolution plan for 2026 represents the most dramatic change yet. Neuralink's R1 surgical robot performs the delicate work of inserting the electrode threads into brain tissue with a precision that human hands cannot match consistently. The threads are positioned relative to the specific neural populations the device needs to monitor, a task that requires spatial accuracy at the scale of individual neurons. The robot performs this placement faster than human surgeons, with less tissue displacement, and with consistency that reduces the variability between procedures that inevitably exist when human technique is the primary determinant of outcome quality. The transition to an almost entirely automated surgical procedure in 2026 means that the R1 robot assumes responsibility for the vast majority of steps that currently involve direct human surgical skill. The entire procedure is targeted to complete in under 30 minutes, a time frame that dramatically reduces the risks associated with anesthesia duration and surgical exposure. For patients who are already living with significant medical complexity, the difference between a 30-minute automated procedure and a multi-hour conventional surgery is not a minor convenience. It is a meaningful reduction in the physiological burden that a procedure imposes on a body that may already have limited reserve capacity. The automation also creates the conditions for scaling the program geographically, because a procedure that depends primarily on a robot's precision can be performed consistently across facilities without requiring the years of specialized training that conventional neurosurgical skill demands. The production target of more than 1,000 implants for 2026 reflects a deliberate transition from the careful, one-at-a-time approach of clinical trial methodology to something that begins to resemble a scalable medical technology rollout. Manufacturing facilities in California and Texas are being prepared to produce implantable chips at rates that have no precedent in brain-computer interface history. The supply chain requirements for devices of this complexity, where failure is measured not in customer inconvenience, but in potential patient harm, demand quality control systems of extraordinary rigor. Every chip that reaches a surgical suite must perform within specification with a reliability that exceeds what consumer electronics require by orders of magnitude. The conditions that currently qualify patients for Neuralink implants reflect where the regulatory and scientific confidence currently sits. The FDA has authorized the devices for patients experiencing paralysis due to spinal cord injuries, those living with Parkinson's disease, individuals managing epilepsy, patients recovering from stroke or traumatic brain injury, and people dealing with vision loss or hearing-related conditions, including tinnitus. These approvals represent the FDA's assessment that the potential benefit to patients in these categories is sufficient to justify the risks inherent in an early-stage implantable neural device. The 12 patients treated so far have provided the safety and efficacy data that supports expanding that authorization, and Neuralink's 2026 plans include pursuing additional FDA approvals that could extend the eligible patient population significantly. One of the most technically significant updates Musk announced at the close of 2025 concerns how the electrode threads interface with the brain's protective membrane, the dura. In previous procedures, accessing the brain tissue required working through this tough protective layer in ways that added procedural complexity.